family and fellow soldiers. I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. Lawrenceville, Georgia, March 7th, 2025. Kadir Malik Lewis and Nazir Rahim Lewis were two teenage twins, practically inseparable. They did everything together. Which is why on March 7th, the two twins were scheduled to fly from their home in Lawrenceville, Georgia, to Boston to visit friends. But they never made their flight. On the morning of March 8th, hikers found the bodies of the two teens at the top of Bell Mountain in Hiawassee, Georgia, which is 90 miles from their home. And the two teens couldn't have been there long because their airline tickets were still in their wallets. The bodies were barely found, though, before the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was automatically claiming that it was a murder-suicide. The teenagers' family members say that the twins had never visited the area where their bodies were found. It's 2.5 hours away from Atlanta, and they said that they didn't believe that their deaths were murder-suicide either.
I couldn't imagine them hurting each other because I never even seen them get into a fist fight before.
How they end out in the mountains, they don't hike out there. They've never even been out there. They don't know nothing about Hiawassee, Georgia. They never even heard of Bell Mountains. So how did they end up right there?
Now, this incident is beyond suspicious, and the family is already going through enough, but of course, due to the dominant society, they always have to make things worse. Enter Scott Curlin, a 42-year-old volunteer firefighter from Hiawassee, Georgia. He's been charged with misdemeanor obstruction when he was accused of taking photos of the two teenagers' corpses and sharing them publicly. That's right, this guy who's supposed to be a volunteer firefighter, he's so concerned about public trust, he decided it'd be a great idea to take photos of two dead kids and then post it on the internet. In fact, some school students in Towns County had gotten a hold of the gruesome images and were passing them around during class. The family's traumatized enough already. In fact, they're scared to even go online for fear of encountering these pictures. Imagine what the mother would think if she came across them. And after what happened to Trayvon Martin, their fears are only too well grounded. And although it was some unrelated hikers who were the ones who actually reported finding the two teenagers, there need to be serious questions asked about this Curlin character after this. Given his behavior, he should definitely be a person of interest if nothing else. And speaking of interest, the authorities also have to be forced to show a lot more. There are serious questions about this incident that are simply not being answered. How did these two teenagers wind up nearly 100 miles from the airport? Airline tickets are not cheap, and they had clearly been deciding they were going to go so far away to visit some friends, and yet they didn't tell anybody that both of them were going to be canceling their flight. In fact, that's the thing, they didn't cancel the flight at all. They still had their airline tickets on them. And not only had the two teenagers never been to that mountain, there's no reports of these two doing hiking at all. This is a hell of a lot of coincidences that brought them there if it was not foul play. It's common sense, and this is why those teenagers' families are so reluctant to accept what the authorities are saying.
They had a huge support system. We know them, but they wouldn't do anything like this. Something happened in those mountains and we want answers.
Reports are that the autopsies have been completed, but an official ruling on the cause and manner of death is still pending additional forensic testing. But the way that the authorities are basically rushing their conclusions on this, it's clearly a formality. Far as they're concerned, it's a murder-suicide, that's their story and they're sticking to it. They just came out with murder-suicide automatically like a knee-jerk reaction. Now, if they do have some sort of rational, reasonable basis for this, at this point they ought to be sharing some details, because these guys couldn't wait to declare it a murder-suicide when there's all of these bizarre circumstances that don't fit that kind of conclusion. Now, unless the authorities have some truly amazing information that they're just sitting on, then this is yet another typical case of the authorities burying a murder. Two of them, in fact. And it's completely logical and reasonable to not trust these authorities. It's logical and reasonable to suspect that they're deliberately trying to cover up foul play because they've been caught doing it before. This double homicide happened in Georgia, and Georgia is the exact same place where the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery almost got away with it, because right after the killing, it was the police and the DA's offices out there who instantly declared that the murder wasn't foul play. Why, it was just self-defense. That was the initial so-called investigation. This is what routinely happens when black people are killed and the authorities realize the real culprit fits a certain profile. It was only because of independent media that broke the story and the public refusing to accept the white authorities' phony story about Ahmaud Arbery's death that the authorities out there were finally forced to do their jobs. It also didn't hurt that you had the 2020 uprisings going on. Finally, the murderers were investigated, charged, and convicted twice and thrown into cages where they belonged. But that would never have happened if the public had simply accepted what the so-called authorities claimed initially. So no, I'm afraid that neither the local investigators or even the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has any credibility precisely because of their putrid track record. The Lewis twins family has pointed out repeatedly that there was no animosity between the two, no history of sibling rivalry, certainly nothing that would lead either one of them to plan a trip together, schedule a flight, and then suddenly both of them, without warning or explanation, just decide they're going to run away from the airport nearly 100 miles away. They were killed in the woods. I don't know about you, but I don't know too many black people who hang out in the woods to begin with. Other groups of people do, which is why it was this creep who came upon their corpses was taking photos of them. This animal should be questioned rigorously, because this kind of behavior is very typical of members of the dominant society. When Kobe Bryant and his daughter died in that helicopter accident, it was the sheriff's deputies out there who were the ones taking photos of their corpses and passing those around. You have a dead father and his teenage child, and this is what the so-called police did. There's no bottom to how evil these sick bastards are. And these are the creatures who infest the police departments and fire departments around this country. This is the kind of trash that these organizations seek out. Walking garbage like this Curling character, they don't just accidentally get into these volunteer fire departments and volunteer police departments and volunteer sheriff's departments or become regular employees and even police chiefs and fire chiefs. This is what these organizations look for because this is their institutional culture, a culture of anti-black racism that is protected from top to bottom by the politicians and the so-called regulating authorities all the way down to the white media and members of the public. This psychopathically racist society has an absolute love affair with celebrating the deaths of black children. From Kobe Bryant's daughter to Trayvon Martin to these two teenagers. Black children are preyed on by these animals who take pictures of their bodies like some degenerate trophy of a demented serial killer. So the family is doing the right thing by demanding answers and not accepting the story that's being given to them by the authorities. They're going to have to do a hell of a lot better than just saying, well, we think that it was a murder-suicide. You got evidence? Well, it's true that we said it. No, that's not good enough, especially not by them. Not good enough by half. Now, since the theme of this morning's briefing happens to be about how these sick, putrid reprobates from the dominant society like to harm black children, we have a follow-up on a story that we covered last year. You had the case of Gene Whitefeather and Donald Lance, two reprobates from West Virginia, who imprisoned and tortured black children for years before finally getting caught. They forced these black children to do heavy labor around their so-called farm, which was basically a shack on a plot of land. They treated these children like animals, locked them in squalid cold rooms, forcing them to sleep on concrete floors, making them stand for hours with their hands on their heads, no access to regular drinking or bathing water, forced to use a bucket for an indoor toilet, and frequently verbally abusing these children with all manner of racial slurs. I mean, they were just indulging all of their sick little whims. Well, I'm pleased to report that on January 29th of this year, a jury found these two guilty on multiple counts of forced labor, human trafficking, child abuse and neglect, as well as civil rights violations. And in an unprecedented act of actual jurisprudence, the judge on the case sentenced these two properly, giving Jean K. Whitefeather a sentence of up to 215 years in prison and her husband getting a term of up to 160 years. And in addition to that, they'll also have to pay $280,000 in restitution to the children. And I say that the first thing those children should have is the title to the land that those creeps had, as well as the house. Sell all of it and give those kids the money. In fact, don't stop at $280,000. They're owed a hell of a lot more than that. Give them title to any and all money and possessions that these inbreds have got and hand the money over. During the ruling, the judge said, "You brought these children to West Virginia, a place that I know as almost heaven, and you put them in hell. This court will now put you in yours, and may God have mercy on your souls, because this court will not." And with that ruling, you can bet that every anti-black racist from Ben Shapiro to Andrew Schultz was shrieking and whining because they know that but for an accidental police investigation, who knows? They too might probably wind up in the same situation. Allegedly. Authorities didn't charge these two with a hate crime, though, so as bad as their behavior was, the sentence should have been worse. And just to show that there's no bottom to the dominant society's depravity, the defense attorneys for these two tried the feeble claim that, oh, this wasn't racial at all. They even tried to claim that all of these unspeakable crimes that were committed against these kids, well, the perpetrators were stressed. They were overwhelmed because these kids had alleged mental issues. So they make up a phony claim about the children in order to blame them for what was being done to them. They were trying to give a wink and a nod to the judge and jury in the hopes that they would all get on code. Well, at least in this case, it didn't work. But this goes to show you, like I reported on last week, that there are evil people in this world who understand that the laws and the system were set up to allow them, certain people, to do whatever evil acts they want. And so they do. You and I understand the sick degeneracy of imprisoning and tormenting children is not what's supposed to happen, but under white supremacy and a culture of absolute white privilege, the sad truth is arresting and sending trash like this to prison, that is what's not supposed to happen. People only act like this when they've been conditioned to know, not to believe, but to know that the authorities approve of their behavior. And when you consider that the so-called authorities almost always know about these people for years before some conscientious neighbor finally exposes them, you realize these animals are right. They're right to assume that the authorities will protect them. Because, as we saw with the case of Kadir and Nazir Lewis, and Kobe Bryant and his daughter, and Ahmaud Arbery, it's the police and sheriff's departments and other agencies whose members also engage in this exact same anti-black racism. Nothing happens in a vacuum under white supremacy, so it's foolish to rule out foul play, especially when the authorities don't give you anything other than their word. We are dealing with rabid anti-black racist individuals who we know from experience to be liars. We don't take anything they say to be true unless they can actually give satisfactory explanations for what they say. Because given the fact of how all too often the authorities celebrate the deaths of black children, if not in many cases are actually the perpetrators of the deaths of black children, if you take their word for anything, all you're really doing is helping someone get away with murder. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Richard Griffith, Samora Morris, Reasonable Dude, Johnny J. Martin, and Terrence Welch. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.